I'll first introduce our moderator, Professor Kyrah Malika Daniels, Assistant Professor of Art History in African and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College, is going to get us started, so please give her a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be leading off our set of conversations today. My name is Dr. Kyrah Malika Daniels, and I'm hoping that we can have some really lively conversation. I am one of the organizers for this year's conference. It's really a pleasure to have you all with us, and I will take full responsibility for this different format because I think that as dynamic and incredible as many of our scholars are, sometimes it can be hard to sit still and listen to somebody drone on for 45 minutes. So I have seen Dialogic Keynotes present a really different format and a different opportunity for conversation between dynamic and exciting scholars, and we thought that our two speakers for today would make for fantastic conversation partners. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce them, to share with you a bit about the format. We'll have a set of conversations that begin focusing on some topics that we've discussed, and then we'd like to open it up for a robust dialogue with you all. So keep tabs of things that you'd like to return to, circle back to, or new avenues and directions that you'd like to travel in. But the title of our Dialogic keynote for this morning is Stories, Rituals, and Ancestors on the Path to Healing. So I'll go ahead and introduce our two speakers. Dr. Yvonne Chireau is professor in the Department of Religion at Swarthmore College, where she teaches courses on theories of religion, Africana religions, and American religious history. She is the author of Black Magic, Religion, and the African American Conjuring Tradition, and the co-editor of Black Zion, African American Religions and Judaism. Her varied thoughts on the historical intersections between magic, Africana religions, comics, and popular culture tropes of Black spirituality can be found at the research blog, The Academic Hoodoo. She is currently co-producing a documentary film about contemporary reclamations of the African American ancestral traditions known as conjure, hoodoo, and root working by millennial practitioners, artists, educators, and entrepreneurs. Dr. Paul Stoller is professor of anthropology at Westchester University. He has published 15 books, including ethnographies, biographies, memoirs, and novels, and is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2013, King Carl, let me practice with my Roman numerals, King Carl XVI Gustav of Sweden presented him the Anders Reitzes Gold Medal in Anthropology. In 2015, the American Anthropological Association awarded him the Anthropology in Media Award. His forthcoming book, Wisdom from the Edge of the Village, Writing Ethnography in Troubled Times, will be published in early 2023. Let's give them a warm welcome. So I wanted to start off with a question about points of departure and orientation. Could you all share with us what led you to your research on African and African diaspora religions, specifically as it pertains to the powers of healing traditions?
I had no intention of studying African healing or anything like that. I went to the Republic of Niger to do a study, a linguistic anthropological study on Friday sermons in the Islamic tradition. And 6 months into my residence in a village called Mehana, I would type up my field notes every day. And I had a little mud brick house, and I had a metal table, and I had a Smith Corona typewriter. I'm dating myself. And I would type up my field notes. And then people from the village would come in and watch this crazy person, sitting at the machine, tapping his fingers, and these these letters would come out on the page. And I started to notice that there were two birds that had made a mud nest in my ceiling, which was daub. And they were starting to poop all over my floor. And being, sort of an antiseptic American, I found this intolerable. So I knocked their nest down. 2 weeks later, they built another nest. And I did the same thing again and again and again. And then finally, I gave up. I said, okay, I'm just going to live with this. It's no big deal. And I was typing my field notes one night, and one of the birds pooped on my head. All right? So I said, I can't stand this place. I have to get out. It's terrible. But one of the people who was watching this episode identified himself as you know me as a rice farmer, but I am a sorko, which is a practitioner of river magic. And he said, I've seen a sign. And I said, well, no shit, So I've seen a sign. So come to my compound tonight, and we'll begin to learn. So I started memorizing incantations, and thus started a 20-year period of apprenticeship. And so, and he taught me something about that. He said, if in these kinds of practices, if you seek it, you will never find it. It has to seek you. That's how I came into it.
What a beautiful story. So, first, I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Evan and Kyrah for.
I know the mics, I think can project, but
Okay.
I know it's for the recording, so.
Is it good? Okay. So, thank you guys.
Yeah,
This has been wonderful. I started a different place. So, I think my first exposure to studying religions began with my community and my family. So, I was raised for the first 10 years of my life in Queens, St. Albans, Queens. My father is an immigrant from the French West Indies. My mother is a native New Yorker. And like many black communities, urban black communities, we were surrounded by religion and culture and diversity. And whether it was St. Peter Claver Parish, whether it was the Fire Baptized Holiness or the AMEZ or Muhammad's Mosque number 7, or the mysterious storefronts on Farmers Avenue with the spiritualist ladies. So I grew up with religious communities with a comfort and a familiarity and a curiosity that I think all of us have, that sort of brings us to the study of religion, at least informally. But this is really what I wanted to say, though. Most of us recall our earliest exposure to the things of the spirit like a first love, right? It's fully earnest, it's heart-centered, and I'm talking about really those extraordinary moments of intervening presence or grace that are not defiled by fear because they match our innocence. And these are feeling encounters with something that's radically other. And all of us have them, right? And all of us have stories of them. And for me, these occurred when I was very young, sort of in a waking dream state. And as I studied this more, one of the things I'm really interested in is this idea of magic or African American conjure. I realized that there is a visionary tradition, for lack of a better word, because academics don't really have a word for this. I've chosen to analyze this in the context of magic, and I'll talk about that why later. But a lot of us have had these experiences of this encounter with the sacred. Usually when we're young, seeing things. There are many, many traditions in African American culture without a way to describe it. And I think those are the places where we first encounter what I believe is love, all right? Later on, we analyze this, we put these in a comparative context, we dissect them, we try to make sense of them, but we never forget that first moment. And I think that's where, for a lot of us who end up studying this thing, that's where the light goes on. So for me, it really began with that. And then later on, sort of taking on that formal study of religion and trying to make sense of it. At that point, you kind of lose something. You lose the wonder, you lose the enchantment, I think you lose the sacredness of the thing. So that's how I got to where I am. As many of you may know, I'm very interested in what scholars call African American folk traditions or vernacular traditions that involve, for lack of a better word, and this is something we talked about before we even started this. Should we use the word magic? Should we use the word sorcery to describe? These are not native terms, right? These are not terms that come from within the communities. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about encounters with something that is uncanny. That's one way of looking at it. Encounters with something that is supernatural. That's another word that we were given. And for me, recovering that and trying to understand that and trying to make sense of that within the culture, particularly African American culture or Africana cultures. That's what got me into this thing. So I have this to me is the stuff of magic and miracles. It's fun. There's a kind of beauty about it, and I think what's relevant here, it produces a kind of sensibility that I believe can be called healing. All right, and I can talk a little bit later as to why that is. So, so this is great.
Thank you both so much. And I really appreciate you both sharing some of these intimate elements of your journey forward, because I think it's very easy. We had I think, a robust conversation about this, some of us yesterday, about this myth of objectivity, right? There are so many of us who enter into our studies and who are told to be a good researcher, to be a diligent researcher, you have to be objective, as if there can be such a thing, right? I think, if anything, recognizing one's positionality can be quite liberating when being truthful about our points of departure. And it reminds us to exercise, I think, a great deal of honesty in terms of how you come to a particular subject. Sometimes we think we choose our topics, but a lot of times they choose us, right? So the second question I wanted to pose is very much in line with how you ended your response, Dr. Chireau, in terms of talking about the language that we use to talk about religion, and specifically the language that we use to talk about Black people's religion. You know, for so many of us, we grow up hearing the most common terms used to describe African and African diaspora religions as things such as magic, sorcery, witchcraft, black magic. And so I wanted to, begin this question by noting that there is tremendous importance in using terms from religious communities themselves, right? So what are the terms that we can think about to talk about harm doing in Songhai nations in Asia? What is the language, what is the vocabulary that people are using in African American communities in the US South? So I wanted to pose a question about, what do you find in your work, personally in your experiences, what is the role of harming agents in healing traditions? We know that these are not entirely discrete categories, but it's also true that we often have to do a lot of work of unlearning that these African-derived traditions are evil. So what is the role of harming agents in healing traditions?
Okay. Should I go?
No, I'll go. No, and this is
Mix it up.
because I struggled with this, and I'll actually be brief on this. I don't want to take a lot of time to talk about harming in African American traditions. Invariably, someone here is thinking about voodoo and voodoo dolls, which sort of derives from a persistent racist fantasy of, it's risen to the level of the pornographic in our society, so it's not really very useful. But yes, as part of the history of Africana healing, there's also a history of harming, which interestingly occurs along a spectrum of curative practices. And this is something that's especially well documented in the historical sources, as well as in the Western colonial imagination. And this is just what I want to say. I think about harming in relation to power. And Paul and I talked a little bit about this. But if hoodoo conjure, if the African American, I'm going to stick with magic for the moment, if hoodoo conjure is a magic healing tradition of the head, the heart, and the hand, it stands to reason that it has a lot to do with power and the moral or immoral uses of power that go with it. So long, compressed answer. It's not that I don't want to talk about harming, but I think that the gaze is upon harming, particularly when it comes to African American spirituality. We simply don't get enough about the healing, but we can talk about that too.
Let me take off on that.
Yeah.
In the Songhai tradition and many West African traditions, there is no distinction between good and bad magic or sorcery. It's just work and practice. And there is no, within those worlds, there is no, it's not, people don't do good things or bad things. It's just power. Yes. It's pure power. And very often in the families that I work with, they're Sohanchi, they're direct descendants of Sunny Ali Bear, the Songhai king in the 15th century, who used his prowess to reign and create an empire. They're members of the same family, and sometimes they will, they use what they do harming kinds of things to members of their own family sometimes, to show that it's sort of like, I like to use it's sort of like gunfighters in the Old West, where who is the fastest gun? There's no morality, it's totally amoral. And so when you enter into that world, you are a potential target for a rival, right? So, and for the longest time, I thought that was what Songhai sorcery magic was about. But then I realized that it was about much more than that. Yes, there is a harming element to it, but ultimately, the goal of Songhai practitioners, who are the spiritual guardians of their communities, is to bring harmony to the world and to bring healing to the world. And the goal is to get people to a point where they feel comfortable in their skin. Mm-hmm. Right? That is the ultimate goal. And I didn't realize this until my teacher had taught me this, many, many years ago. But I didn't realize this until I faced my own serious illness and I faced my mortality. And I realized that rather, what I needed to do was not to focus on the sort of negative side of these kinds of practices, but to focus on the fact that the ultimate goal is to create this harmony, a harmony between the relationship of the village to the bush. And the bush is uncontrollable, it's powerful, and if there's a lack of harmony, then you really can't, the village becomes susceptible to all sorts of awful things. And I remember, my teacher telling me, Aramujeni Tongo, he told me that, his job was to maintain harmony, to correct all of the disrespect that people did to the bush, to nature, and he would perform rituals to restore the balance that was upended by people in the community. And that was his work, and every day he would make sacrifices, he'd recite incantations to create this harmony, and that was the ultimate goal. And the thing about Songhai practitioners also is that when you are young, you're taught to do all sorts, you're taught about plants, incantations, where to go find curative plants used in magical rites. But as you mature, Songhai believe that the mind ripens slowly with experience. And then the greatest lessons that are learned are always learned when someone becomes an elder. So, because you've had enough experience, your mind is ripened enough to understand that all of these practices are about ultimately healing and harmony. And so, but it took me 25, 30 years to understand that through my own experience and through and understanding the lesson that he presented to me a very long time ago.
And let me just add on top of that, I completely agree with the idea, and I hope we can expand a little bit on the notion of healing as a maintenance of harmony. But it gets really interesting and really important in the context of American, Black American culture under slavery. How does one heal trauma? How does one heal intergenerational bonds that have been broken in relationship? So we get to the place where resistance using harming, all right? So certain spiritual practices in hoodoo conjure were used as a form of resistance against slave masters, the regime, and so forth, the slave-owning regime. That even becomes, harming becomes healing. So it gets really, really interesting in these contexts. But what I wanted to say is that, it's not simply because I love the idea of healing as being this restoration, right? It's a restoration of balance. But in the hoodoo, and it's so wonderful to hear Paul talk about this, because you can actually see the sources of what we later find in Black American traditions in Hoodoo conjure. But and I wrote this out because it's such a beautiful thing to me. The conceptualization of healing in Hoodoo conjure, in African American magic tradition, it emerges out of an awareness of the living attributes of elements, nature, but our relationship to those things. So I'll just say that again. The living attributes that, it's sort of what you might even call this is an anthro term I don't like, an animistic view, but the idea that this is life and this is a living thing, and our relationship. So the powers that are inherent in the earth, these are what the conjurers used. The dirt, the lodestone, the crystals that seed the land, right? The plants, the strong, courageous roots, and one of the most powerful roots became a human being named High John, okay? The fungi that brings visions, right? The fauna, the animal kingdom, and the non-human species. So these living beings make no judgment as to their appropriate use by humans. It could be an inappropriate use. You can use that to poison, that fungi to poison as well as to heal. It may be balanced or not. So this notion of relationship, I really do want us to expand upon that, and that's where I think we will, I'm jumping the gun, but we can bring in this notion of the ancestor and where that fits in. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes tremendous sense. And I mean, one of the things that I'm hearing in both of your responses, we, in the Western world, we say in a lot of different cultures, one says with power comes responsibility. And I think both of you are underscoring that spiritual power bears many different degrees of responsibility to one's community, right? And I think this is so much in line with African understandings of ritual power and, what some people call magic, what some people call sorcery, what we can call really spiritual power is like fire. That's the analogy that I use with my students, right? Because fire is something that can be used to cook our food, to keep us warm, right? To create a community. It can also cause tremendous devastation if it burns down a community, right? And so you wouldn't say fire is good, fire is bad. In the same way, spiritual power is not good, it's not bad. It's how it is channeled. It is how it is used. It is how it is deployed. And I remember, in working with healers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, several times I encountered healers, priests, and priestesses saying, people think that they're powerful when they can cause harm. But it's actually very easy to cause harm because it can be either intentionally done or it can be unintentionally done, right? I mean, in the Western world, we don't always think about this, but I try to use the example of ulcers. What causes an ulcer? Stress. So if you're in a toxic work environment and you're dealing with people who don't want you to succeed, who want to see your downfall, they may not even intentionally be trying to harm you, but in fact, you feel the physical as well as psychological ramifications of that harm doing that are subconscious. And so a lot of the healers whom I worked with said, it's not actually difficult to harm. The real power is if you can heal. The real power is if you have been able to transform energy that has been negatively manifested and provide healing for somebody. So before we have our final question, let's spend a little bit of time there. Can we speak a little bit more? Both of you have mentioned the power of healing as a way of either maintaining peace or restoring harmony to a community. Can you talk a little bit more about that in your respective traditions?
Go.
Go ahead.
You.
Okay, so the idea of healing as a way of maintaining peace.
Harmony,
I
whatever.
tend to think of it as maintaining relationship. I always come back to relationship between human beings, relationship between those healing agents of the earth that I mentioned, relationships between the elements in the human being. So it seems to me that the goal of the healing, just exactly as you said it, is to restore sort of a balance between the human being and the environment, the world that they're in. Again, this becomes really salient during slavery in what became the United States, where we're not just talking about healing the body, healing the physical body. That's the first thing we think of. That's certainly a big part of it, but we're talking about healing relationships between human beings and their ancestors, which had been severed. We're talking about healing relationships between human beings and the environment. We're talking about family, kin, and so forth. So in my way of thinking, it seems that the physical healing, that sort of, it's not that it comes last, but and it's not that that's the easiest, but that's the most apparent. So some of my sources, some of the most spectacular kinds of healing are, the physical healing that they call, the conjurer, the use of the legerdemain in order to pull the snakes out of. And there's a lot of wonderful lore stories, which is really the juicy stuff, the stories about healing that come from Black folk. That's the physical stuff, pulling the snakes out of the body or healing the physical body. But for me, and it seems to be, if you read and you hear these stories, it's the healing of the relationship that is paramount. And again, particularly in that context of enslavement, when bodies, and this is an interesting thought, right? Does the enslaved person have agency over the body? Okay, the law says you don't own your body. Can you heal your own body? What is your relationship to the physical body that needs healing? And of course, slave owners had a very particular interest in this. So, short answer, the physical healing is wonderful. I think that's an important part of the tradition, but I think we're talking about healing relationships and restoring a balance between relationships that has been brought about through imbalance.
So, in my experience, the work of the Sohanchi healer is to restore, create a kind of balance between the bush and the village. And there have been, recently in Niger, but in other places of the world, that balance has been uprooted. I mean, the balance, we have all sorts of issues with climate. So in Niger, for example, they have many years where it rains too much, it washes the crops away. Other years there's drought, there's sickness, there's locusts, there's a lot of suffering. It's a very poor place. And so people are always living on the edge, and there has to be ecologically, there has to be a very delicate balance for the crops to work. So you have to have a certain amount of rain in May, a certain amount of rain in June, a little bit more in July, a lot in August, not too much in September, a warm October, then you have a good harvest. If any of those things get out of whack, then the harvest is compromised, people will be hungry, children will die. And this is the reality that they live with year in and year out, day in and day out. And so for me, living that existence has made them very sensitive to the limitations that life places upon them. But they live very robustly within those limitations. And that's one of the great lessons that my teacher taught me, is that, understand what your situation is and live as robustly within it as you can. And the Songhai people, they just amaze me because of the conditions in which they live, but they live robustly, right? So, so the work is always to try to create a ritual, spiritual balance in the community, as well as a balance between, as I said before, the bush and the bush and the village. And I see this as something that I think about this, and anthropologists and other scholars have been gathering information about this kind of wisdom for a long period of time, and yet this wisdom is not widely known or widely applied because we live in contexts of mastery. We are the masters of nature. We are the people who master one another, and this is absolutely contrary to the Songhai and other West African notions of how people should live. So you have this body of wisdom that's there which is really appropriate to the current moment of people mastering one another, people killing one another, hate, racism, religious intolerance. All of this, my teacher would say, all of this is because we're not paying attention to the harmonizing traditions. And if we pay attention to those, we can apply those, we can perhaps create the kind of change that we need in order to confront some of the problems that we're confronting today.
Indeed.
So it's, this indigenous wisdom is something, it's a source that is there, but it's untapped. And for me, you know, I feel like my responsibility, my teacher said, you know, at one point he said, I want my work to become your work. What he meant by that was he wanted me to tell the story of his life and convey as best as I could his wisdom so that more people would be exposed to it. And, you know, and so that's I think that's a kind of scholarly obligation. What are our obligations as scholars?
That's right.
As the, we are the, you know, we have this knowledge. What is our greatest obligation? Well, for the Songhai practitioner, the greatest obligation, having learned all this stuff, is to pass the knowledge on to the next generation. That is the sacred obligation of any specialist. Pass it on to the next generation. And my teacher taught me all that he did so that I could, you know, convey it to some of his sons who are too young to learn, but also so that I would take it out into the world as best I could to deliver his message about healing and harmony to other people and have them use it as they will. And so, which comes to another point, which is about how we convey our knowledge. The language we use. We've talked about sorcery and magic, but also what about how we write as scholars, and how does that do justice to the knowledge that we have? Generally not.
Generally not.
Generally not. And so, you know, my teachers always told me, said, you know, they conveyed their knowledge to me through stories. And so there's a great passage in this wonderful book by Tim O'Neill called The Things They Carried. It's about the Vietnam War. And there's one point, it's a kind of bleak novel, but at one point he talks about stories, and he says stories are, you know, when you don't know your front side from your back side. Stories are when you think everything, you know, you tell stories when you're bleak, and he said, when everything else seems to be lost, there's always the story. The story remains. And so stories are something that connect people. They connect people. And so one way to convey this important knowledge to a larger audience that is, I think, you know, in need of this kind of wisdom is to write narratives or produce films that are narrative films that convey this information. I think, you know, we need it. We need it.
So for me, as a writer of religious history, I tend to be more comfortable in the archives than with people. I prefer to consort with those who are no longer with us in form, in physical form, but whose voices are no less powerful. So in thinking about this conversation today, I pulled up a 1984 essay by Toni Morrison. It's a wonderful essay. It's called The Ancestor as Foundation. And Morrison, of course, is a consummate storyteller. But the form she chose was the novel. There's other traditions, of course. But this is what struck me in looking at that article again, and really in line with what Paul's getting at. Morrison says that, and she talks about the African-American traditions of storytelling, and again, not just the novel form, but the performed text and the oral text and the image. And she says, a story should be both beautiful and powerful, but it should also work, all right? Absolutely. And it should have something that enlightens, something that opens the door and points the way. But that word work, that's a Black American euphemism for describing acts of metaphysical transformation, creation, conjuring, manifestation. It's work. So working the spirit, working the root, workings of power in magic and art. So the story, Morrison is saying, does an actual kind of work, a kind of conjuring work, if you don't like magic. So, and that's where the power is. So, right on the same page. I'd like to connect this to the ancestors a little bit, if I have time. And,
Yes. We always have time for ancestors.
Yes.
Absolutely.
If we can get that picture
Thank you, John.
up there. It's
Switch to her slide.
It's the last slide. I'm so taken with this. It's her
PowerPoint.
slide. It's the PowerPoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Yeah,
John.
and I'm so taken with this image, and I'm not going to be long because I know where. This is Ava DuVernay, the writer, director, the film writer, modeling a fashionable T-shirt, and another image of the current king, the Yoruba king of Oyotunji village, Adeboyu Adefumi II, who was decreed ruler after an interregnum following the passing of his father, Oba Osejime I. And I like to juxtapose these pictures because they say so much about how a sensibility of ancestralism pervades Black American culture today, and how a story can become a reality. So Oyotunji Village, as some of you may know, is a Black American religious intentional community that was established as an African nation here in American soil along the Gullah Geechee corridor. And Professor Tracy Hux's extraordinary study of this book, I recommend it to everyone, which is about religious and racial nationalism, but it's not like the current form of white Christian nationalism, which is, I think, born of rancid grievances and political alienation. But this is the story of a most profound recovery of myth story, right? And the reappropriation of ancestral territory as a spiritual homeland. And it's a story of healing, all right? Because Oyotunji establishes or reestablishes the divine sacred history of Black Atlantic people, even in the aftermath of profound trauma, okay? So it's grounded in the spiritual work that redeems the African ancestors and brings them into the now. So it's a fascinating story, but it's a real story. Like other intentional communities, the idea of Oyotunji was to create a free religious space, one that existed completely outside of white supremacy, apart from the oppressed, victimized Blackness that had become a way of life in Black America, and where Black Americans' humanity had been subsumed by the totalizing forces of Atlantic slavery. So by telling the stories of what they called the originating ancestors, okay, by bringing these stories as a theophany into the present, these people drew the sacred past into the present, all right? And so Oyo, the birthplace of human civilization of the Yoruba proper in West Africa, rose again in the head, the heart, and the hands. All right? This is the magic. This is the cornerstone, the head, the heart, and the hands of its descendants in a diasporic homeland for Black Americans in Sheldon, South Carolina, in a strange and forest land. So I juxtapose these images because, as with any story of returning home, the future is created as a place from our reclamations of the past. The idea that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams prompts African descendants, and this is from Tracy Hux, to reattach the severed spiritual and genealogical cord, okay? To reattach the cord.
Can I add something?
Yes.
So what you're just saying gets replayed every time a practitioner recites an incantation over a substance. So for example, there's one kind of incantation, it's called haroguso, which is a water container, but you put in the water and then you sprinkle it with special herbs, and you do it in a counterclockwise way. There's 7 different herbs that you put in there. And then you recite the incantation. And when you recite the incantation, it's always, I'm speaking in the 7 heavens, I'm speaking in the 7 hells, right? I'm speaking to the east, the west, the north, the south. I'm speaking to my ancestor. You name your ancestor, and you go back, father of so-and-so, father of so-and-so, father and so, until it comes to me. Your words came into my head. They're in my mouth. I spit 3 times. Your energy is in the substance.
It's an embodiment.
That's right.
That's what it is, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, we're vibing. We're vibing.
That was the hope.
Wonderful, wonderful thing. So I wanted to bring it back to ancestors, and somehow the conversation came back, because I think that this is something that is really coming around again in African American culture. And again, I love these T-shirts. You know, we can look in the popular culture. You know, I think about the fantastic vista of Wakanda, right? This was the black utopia of the African futurist imagination. But this isn't a new idea, right? So here, even at Yale University, right, we think of the early dream that's fulfilled by those Puritans in the wilderness seeking to create a new Zion, their city on the hill. So stories of African-American religious encounters, whether they're in Oyotunji or in accounts of black hoodoos and conjurers that are offering this vision of relationship and restoring relationship by bringing the ancestral into the present. I think that this is a kind of sensibility that really pervades the culture. Whether you call it religion or not, whether you call it magic or not, some are even moving toward an idea of science, a mystical science is sort of opening the way. I think that this is a very good thing that we see happening now.
And Paul, did you want to show us some of your images before we
Sure.
open it up to
Yeah.
questions?
So I like to say that, once I get the images up, I sit on the shoulders of my mentors. Yeah, I sit on the shoulders of my mentors. And my mentors, if we can go to the first, well, this is Adamujeni Tongo, who lived to be, he's not, this is the one, hold on.
Sorry.
This guy here his name is Abdoulaye Cisse. He is a Fulani who lived in a Songhai town, and he was a Muslim cleric who practiced herbal medicine and taught me a great deal about Islamic philosophy and herbal medicine. Let's get to the next slide. This woman her name is Fatuma Saini, and she was my professor of divination. She taught me divination. And the way that came to pass was I like food, and I like to watch people making food. So I was wandering through the village, and she and her a group of women were together, and they were pounding millet with a mortar and pestle. So they invited me to come in, and we got into a conversation, and I became a constant visitor to them every couple of days. And then I found out, and then she asked me to come in, and she heard that I had been studying work. In Songhai, magic and sorcery is called work, and you learn, and the practices are called charms, right? So learning how to do charms. So I heard you're doing that, but those are my cousins, but I know something they don't know. And I said, what is that? Divination. I got it from my mother, my grandmother. And I said, can you teach me? And she said, no.
That's right.
You can't, you're not ready. You're not ready. Well, when will I be ready? You'll know. You know when you're ready. So I said, come back. So that 5 years passed, I come back, and so she invites me to, she said, okay, bring a vial of perfume, right? So I got this perfume, oil-based perfume called Bint al-Hadash. And I give it to her, and she said, that's the wrong perfume. Wrong perfume. I said, well, bring me Bint. Well, let's try it anyway, if you want to, but it's, So she has a ritual container called the bata, and she opened it up, and there was lots of other perfume vials in there. She put the perfume vial in, and then she said, let's wait, and let's see what happens. So we wait, we drink some tea. We go back in about 15 minutes later. She opens up the bata, and the vial that I brought was smashed to bits. She said, I told you it was the wrong perfume. So go get the right one. So I went back, and I got the right perfume, Bint al-Sudan, and we did the same thing. And then after about 20 minutes, we started to smell the perfume coming out of the bata. And she said, that's a sign. I can teach you now.
Ready.
So So she taught me, she was a very graceful woman, very modest, graceful, but renowned for her powers of divination. People would come from many miles to consult with her. Can we see the next slide? This is Adamujeni Tongo tending to a woman who's possessed. And he had the sort of healing touch. Do the next one. I don't want to. That's a portrait of my teacher, Adamujeni Tongo, and he's about 85 years old there in this photo. He lived to be about 105. Mm-hmm. And I met him when I was teaching English as a foreign language in the secondary school, and his compound was on a dune above it. And I started, again, music brought me to him. So I heard this music, these drums. I walked up to his compound, and it was a spirit possession ceremony going on. And he invited me in. He said, welcome, come in and see what's going on. And people were dancing around, people were frothing at the mouth, they were moaning and groaning. I didn't know what the hell was going on. And then he said, I started swaying to the music. And he said, do you want to dance? And I said, yeah, I'll try it. So I went out there and I tried to do the dance as best I could. It wasn't great, but it was okay. And then he said, I want you to come, you showed our respect for us. Come back to tomorrow or whenever we have a ceremony, and come to our ceremonies. And that was the beginning of my relationship with him, which lasted more than 25 years. Mm. So he was a really profound guy. I think that's enough because we're going to have time for questions.
Well, this is an opportunity for us to continue the conversation, and we have about 10 minutes, maybe 12 if we can squeeze it. And I want to ask, are there questions, comments, reflections that you all want to share, that you want to pose? Yes, please feel free to turn your mic on. It is on when it's green. Feel free to introduce yourself and pose your comment or question.
Hi, my name's Tamara. Excuse me, I'm speaking later today, and I'm lighting up like a pinball machine with all of this. This is really exciting. I wanted to just add to the discussion earlier about pain and harm, and the ways of speaking about ulcers, speaking about fire and its potential for destruction. And then one of the things I've noticed in my research with Sufi groups in North Africa, that the group I work with evolved out of the trans-Saharan slave trade, is there's an idea about pain as being a catalyst, even inflicting physical pain as a catalyst for healing. So for example, in trance, people will beat themselves with pieces of iron. They'll take knives upon themselves, and there's an idea about intensification there that reminded me of the ways that we might seek out a sad song to make us cry when we're suffering. So there's a phenomenon there about moving deeper into a painful experience that can even be thought about as harm, that then has a way of catalyzing or transforming that experience. So when we're discussing these ideas of harm, and in the context I'm working in, they speak of suhur, or this often translated as black magic, or other kinds of harmful practices. A lot of times these are employed in ritual as ways of transforming pain into a kind of maintenance. So I just wanted to echo that, as well as that importance of not the binary between harm and healing. Thank you very much.
As you were talking, my mind went in all, not that I wasn't listening to you, but it sort of triggered different things. And, I'm always bringing this back to the Black American context, in which I look at really 19th century, early 20th century traditions. And the thing I thought about, you're saying these people it's self-inflicting pain, and then they, that's the catalyst. And it came to mind, it's really interesting, because I'm still stuck in the storytelling. The blues. So the blues is the Black American art form, right? And it wasn't just an art form. It was a story by which Black people talked about the various traumas without talking about the traumas. So, you know, and everyone's heard the blues. But the blues were embedded. This is the music of hoodoo conjure, all right? And because blues are regional, and hoodoo conjure is regional too. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about, oh, so where do we hear these stories and narratives of pain? Well, they come out in the blues. I lost my, you know, I think the parallel with the blues is hip hop today, the hardcore stuff. You know, I'm suffering, you know, prison, oppression. I don't have it. I don't have any love. It's this constant, you know, reiterating of pain. But because it's associated with this tradition, it's also associated with a kind of healing. So my mind jumped in a weird way to think about that. But I always want to keep bringing it back to the stories, you know, and how even telling the stories of harming or healing, they evoke a kind of, to me, it's a kind of wonder, that even when the stories are horrifying, and I'll just give you one quick example. Some of the stories that were most fascinating to me, I think I alluded to them, are the stories where, and there's tons of these that are documented, where the conjurer or the goofer man or the brujeria will remove a snake. You know, in the South, it's usually, you know, a terrapin, a gopher, and these are the signs of the pain. I'm having a stomach ache. Well, I can see it. It's a gopher rolling around. You know, you have these stories that are extraordinary, spectacular stories. And the healing is take the thing out, and yeah, you got a terrapin in your belly.
That's right.
Now, some of us hearing them are, well, this is utterly ridiculous. And Zora Neale Hurston, she even uses the word. She says, well, they're lies. But they're not lies in the way that we understand them. They are articulating the pain and the healing in a way, the manifestation. And, you know, so what do we do with it? Well, yeah, there's supernatural stories, it's whatever we want to call it. But I think it's in the story that's where the real action is. And you can tell it really excites me. So,
No.
Yes, please, go ahead. Use the mic and introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Nadelka.
Good morning.
Thank you for all that was shared. Oh, this is so awkward, sorry. So I want to get back to the idea of scholarly obligation.
I'm so glad.
I'm a career educator and musician who is the daughter of Afro-Panamanians. My way of learning in my house was very much watch. Things weren't necessarily spoken. You know, I know how to make rice and peas by watching my mother do it every Sunday morning. I also know that I've worked with students who are brilliant and they have other ways of knowing, being, and doing that are not honored in schools. And so therefore I won't see them in spaces like this, but as a musician, I know they contribute significantly to the art that's in the world. I also know that when I've taken an Afrocentric class, it was taught by someone that was white. And so I'm wondering what are the ways that we can start to actually apply this sentiment in academia. We talk about it really well. It's brilliant, it's clear, we know it should be done, but yet it's not. And so I'm wanting to know what are some actual ways that we can begin to address academic obligation to opening up the space for other ways of learning, being, and doing, as well as inviting those who are practitioners and who have direct connections to the ancestry of it.
I have a response. So one way to do it is to treat ethnography, in case we're anthropologists, as art, right? So, which means that when you write or film, I'll speak about writing, that you create a text that does three things. One thing is it establishes a sense of place, a very sensuous sense of place and space. Two, that you the people that you're writing about, you have dialogue, like a fiction writer has dialogue, so that their words become, they jump off the page. 3, to create a sense of character. Very often in academic texts, the people we write about, what are their idiosyncrasies? What do they walk like? What are their passions? We don't get that. Combining those 3 things creates a powerful narrative, or can create a powerful narrative. And narratives are powerful tools that connect writer and reader. And the goal of writing a good narrative is to have the text jump off the page into the reader's mind. And so, and that's one way. It's not the only way. We're not going to replace academic text writing, but it is it's complementary. There's a way of doing it that, and then when you do that, you increase your audience, you increase the conversation, and the goal of my writing at least is to generate conversation, like we're having today, generate conversation, and create a sense of connection. And so, another element of that, of course, is for a writer to make himself or herself vulnerable, vulnerability. So if you reveal some aspect of yourself in you, especially when you're dealing with things like spirit possession or conjuring, whatever it is, that is another way of connecting your being to the person reading about your experience. It's a difficult enterprise because you are exposing yourself, but it is a necessary one if you want to connect with your audience such that your work, your ideas, or the wisdom of the people you're trying to convey reaches an audience and gets talked about and maybe gets applied to solve a problem.
Like, not that my mother and my grandmother and my aunt are not able to read and write English, but these are people who read the spirit stronger than they would a book. And so when you're saying that, you're still talking about, and I'm not negating what you're saying, not am I trying to be like unnecessarily confrontational, but I'm deeply concerned about the fact that these are women who are deeply wise.
Yeah.
But yet, because they're also not people who speak a lot. They tend to be quiet because they are maybe intimidated by the language that is used in these kinds of spaces, but yet they have so much that need to be given. And so when we write things in a book, not that we won't read it, but there are other ways of reading
Of course.
and writing, reading the spirit, and these kinds of ways that we do not teach. And I'm a divinity school student, I'm loving my experience, but there is yet still another way of reading that is in the realm of spirit that we're not talking about.
Although, and I'm actually probably the most pessimistic about this. I actually think that even, the Academy, even given the prestige of the Academy, I think it's not even a contradiction. I don't think that there is space for these kinds of ways of learning, these kinds of knowledges, as it stands. Particularly, this attitude of materialism, it really does exclude subjective experiences. But if any place where one could have these conversations, it would be in my field, in religion. After all, divinity schools, the Christian church, theology, they have theorized, they have come up with methodologies to talk about the relationship of things like literacy, orality, but they do it within the context of Christianity. So comparative religions comes along and says, hey, there's other religions out there, and there's a wall that goes up. So there's religion, and then this thing called theology and Christianity. So, that's what makes me pessimistic, the fact that there is a hierarchy here. There's a hierarchy of knowledge. That's the origin of our discipline, okay? It's a colonial enterprise. The study of religion is, so I'm more pessimistic that you can sort of undo the, what is it, dismantle the master. I'm very pessimistic about that. And I would actually be wary. When I teach, I always have practitioners. If you can have a preacher come in or a Christian scholar, you could have a voodooisant or someone come in. But it never feels like it's the place. It never feels like it's the place for it. What we do is we analyze, we interpret, we theorize, we apply our specific methodology to the thing. So what you're and I don't mean to be such a downer, but what you're talking about, there may not be a space for it yet in this kind of academy that we're a part of. And I love what I do. I love being a part of this guild. But I don't think it's going to get us to the kind of knowledge and wisdom and I don't know what it would look like even if we brought that in. So I'm sorry to be as negative.
Well, I'll bring an Afro-optimist perspective here as we close out, if I may. I mean, I think that if we turn to those such as bell hooks, teaching to transgress, if we think about those like Paulo Freire, I think that the classroom can be a radical space of possibility. And I agree with you. And I think, what both of you are pointing to is that within the institutions that exist, that come out of colonial structures of white domination, there seems to be very little room to push back. But within our classrooms, we have a great deal of agency. So I always conclude my classes with final projects that steer away from just a traditional research paper. And here I have to honor my own beloved mentor, Dr. Barbaro Martinez Ruiz, who had us as a final assignment in an intro to African arts class, recreate an African art form. That's something that I now do in my own classes. I have my students conduct ethnographic interviews or oral history projects with devotees and create final projects that they are obligated to share then with the devotees who took time out of their busy schedules. And what I think that does is it disrupts the idea that they are only regurgitators of knowledge that exists. It allows them to experiment with artistic production, creation, gain respect for a craft, a technique that they know they cannot master in a semester. But it also requires them a sort of humbling and vulnerability that allows them to see, wow, there are different ways of communicating these stories, of honoring these stories. And ultimately, if that's something that's offered to the communities that we are, quote unquote, studying, hopefully engaging in long-term relationships with, rather than just a sort of, I am studying you, then I think that that can create a really radical possibility for difference. So I want to thank you all so much, and special thanks to our Dialogic keynote speakers.